This week, Aidan Holland from Censys is with us to discuss the state of internet attack surface. Then Kelly Shortridge from Fastly joins us to talk about realigning the security industry. Finally, in the enterprise security news, some big acquisitions. Palo Alto picks up Talon, Travelers Insurance picks up Corvus, PagerDuty acquires Gelio, Fusion Auth, ChainGuard, Graylog, Cowbell, and more raise funding. What does security actually mean? The changing world of security exits? 6 questions every board should ask its CISO, meta-analysis of the top MITRE attack techniques, lessons from the SEC's lawsuit against SolarWinds, all that and more in this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Cyber threats target digital identities. Do you know who or what is accessing your company's apps, systems, and data? You need to know who's there, who to let in, and who to keep out. And you'll need more than access management to stay secure. You need SailPoint Identity Security. As the leader in identity security, SailPoint can help mature your security resilience while driving efficiencies and compliance for your organization. Start your identity journey with SailPoint's free maturity assessment. Go to securityweekly.com/SailPoint to get your free identity security assessment today. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy Chaos Never Dies Day. This is episode 339, recorded on Thursday, November 9th, 2023. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Czar of Zero Trust, the captain of content, Katie Teitler. How you doing, Katie?
I'm fine. I would say we're about to create some chaos, but that's just not true. We're just not that chaotic over here. Oh, well, you might be. You might be. Okay, that's fair. Happy Chaos Day to you too, Adrian.
Yeah, and it's I think it's a lot of fun that we're going to talk about that today, because with our second interview, Kelly Shortridge authored the book Security Chaos Engineering. So it seems very appropriate that just happens to be one of the many silly national, international days that's been declared on today.
Well, I will bring up for everybody listening, if you're listening on November 9th, at November 10th is National Vanilla Cupcake Day, and that is very important to me personally. So I hope you all indulge.
We've got room to celebrate more than one thing. I think we can do that, right?
We can.
In fact, that would go right along with it being Chaos Never Dies Day, is celebrating many, many things on this day, not just one. All right, quick announcement here. You can join our Discord channel, which I am staring at right now, to chat with our hosts, ask questions, customize live stream alerts, and more. Visit securityweekly.com/Discord to receive an invite. And yeah, just pop in there, say hello. You can ask questions during the live show, or you can just pop in there whenever and ask questions whenever. We do look at that channel. All right, so for today's first interview, the topic is Internet Attack Surface. We're excited to have Aidan Holland, who is a software engineer at Censys, with us today, and he's done a lot of cool stuff there. He played pivotal roles in the creation of the Censys search engine and Censys Python SDK. He also led development of the Censys Cloud Connector and was at the helm of the groundbreaking Censys GPT project. Welcome, Aidan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on for this one. So this is a really interesting one for me. So I've actually worked on projects back when Mirai came out. That's when I took my first stab at scanning the entire internet myself, because I found a lot of the details I was looking for on that botnet I couldn't really find. And then, after I figured out how to do that without getting sued or kicked off DigitalOcean, where I was doing my scanning from, I used that in a few other projects. But I think it's a good place to start with what we're talking about here with what Censys does. Like, I don't know. I think when most people say the public internet, in their mind, it's this, it's like saying the universe, right? Or like talking about how many stars are in the galaxy. It seems like this impossibly huge thing, but there are companies that scan the whole thing and analyze those results, right?
Certainly, yeah. Companies all over the place. Everyone thinks of Google as the main internet scanning company or the web search engine, but there's so much more information under the hood. Whether it's like TLS certificates, other services that are just not on 80 or 443. There's tons of extra stuff, and it's really interesting to be able to scan it. We see, obviously the entire IPv4 space, and then parts of the IPv6 space, which obviously we're not walking, but are vastly interesting to look at the data we do have for that.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I think that mainly started out as like a research project for some folks. I think even Censys itself maybe started out as a university project. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah. We're out of University of Michigan and originally started as a ZMAP, which is play on Nmap here. But we took that and scaled it into a full internet scanning company, and then we built an attack surface management platform on top of that data.
Yeah, and I remember playing with that tool. That was one of the tools that I was playing with back in the day. And it's so maybe some context around this, like how many IPv4 addresses do you have to scan to do this, and how long does it generally take to do a scan of the internet?
Absolutely. So we're actually able to hit each IPv4 address every 4 minutes. Not on every port. It takes a full day to do a full port scan for all 65K ports. But we actually see about 240 million IPv4 addresses and 150 million IPv6 addresses. So less visibility into the IPv6 space, but we do that based off of Quad A records. So it's a little easier than walking the entire space.
Right, and that's just because the possible IPv6 space is so incredibly huge, right?
Most certainly, yeah. It's if you look at, there's some pretty good charts, such as like the Hilbert curve. You can see which portions of it are kind of allocated for public use. It's about 3/4 of the IPv6 space that you can actually find yourself having an address for. But it is quite difficult to get that fully walked. I think it's what is it? 8 to the, I think it's 16th addresses. It's an insane quantity.
Yeah. Well, and that was kind of the point, right? Is IPv4 exhaustion. We were running out of possible addresses. They were getting expensive. So, yeah, we needed something that scaled much, much larger.
Most certainly. And it certainly worked. We're seeing a lot more people kind of switch to IPv6, but not as much as classic IPv4, which standard cloud providers are still using for almost all of their containers and elastics with containers and such.
So, we mentioned it started as a research project, turned into a business. How do people use this generally? Like how do like the paid version of this? What are people actually using the platform for?
Certainly. So there's a couple different use cases we really cater for. There's a lot of researchers who actually use our data. Some of them are in the academic space doing things like what you are with looking at Mohari and other C2s and other threat actors. There's also just people who are interested in what type of TLS ciphers people are using, getting statistics on that. When there's new breaches and things that come out, it's really interesting to be able to go out and say, hey, show me all of those products that are out there that are, either running that software or are vulnerable to a new CVE. Those are our two largest use cases for search. There's definitely other use cases where it's, monitoring your own attack surface from the external perspective. So if you wanted to check your domain, you wanted to check your IPs, you can go through and do that. It's a little easier to do with more of an automated tool. But for search, it's mostly exploration or for research purposes.
And then the actual depth of the data that you get, right? Like it's more than just, hey, port 139 is open to the public internet or port 23. I imagine you're also capturing banners and things like that. Like how deep can you go and not get yourself in trouble, right? Can you attempt to log into things with default credentials so you can determine whether.
Yeah, we do not do any credential trying any default credentials. So it's purely from a unauthenticated perspective. So we do capture banners. We do capture the chain for the cipher. We also capture the TLS key itself. And we also have a lot of information we're able to add to that, whether it's about the autonomous system, the location, the ASN block you're in. You're also able to see a whole bunch about the software that able to identify, specifically on HTTP. We have a bunch of other, services that we scan for, such as like Cobalt Strike, which is one that I'm pretty interested in at the moment. But we're also able to add things like JARM, JA3, all of that type of stuff. We're able to enrich the initial data. So it's pretty interesting to be able to see and be able to do analysis on those patterns across like several hosts. It's rather fascinating.
Right. In JA3, you're talking about fingerprinting some of these services, right?
Certainly, yeah. So we do have things like banner hashes, but when it comes to TLS, and personally, I follow a lot of like C2s. They're not going to advertise themselves, especially if they do practice good OPSEC. So a lot of them will be hidden behind a combination of JARM or JA3, or hopefully in the future JA4. But it's kind of hidden in these fields that are not abundantly apparent to the average scanner or the average user.
Yeah, so I think the thing that was really fascinating here, again, back to the Mirai example, the Mirai botnet could have been built at any point in time. It could have been built in 2012 and 2014. It just happened to pop up in, I think it was 2016 that it was assembled. That people just realized, hey, there's all this stuff connected to the public internet. I can reach out, I can touch it. It has default credentials. What if I just took control of all that stuff and pulled it into one giant machine? So yeah, ever since then, I think that kind of captured the imagination, and a lot of researchers started really looking harder at this data and saying, okay, what's the next Mirai, right? Like what's the next group of thousands of low-hanging fruit that could be exploited for whatever kind of profit. So go ahead.
Seen some of it related to specifically MoveIt and some of these other like mass file transfer services. People generally don't secure those on their home networks as well as they should. But we are seeing a lot of C2s and botnets kind of spin up in that realm. But similar to the Mirai, that people generally target things like printers and other vulnerable devices that aren't made with the OPSEC in mind.
Yeah, and I think there's a legacy version of Confluence out there. Seeing some stats on that I assume came from a service like yours, where there's still like thousands of people running their own, this on-prem version of Confluence that's vulnerable.
Certainly, yeah. We were actually tracking that within the last couple of weeks. It's been fascinating to see because we're actually able to tell this explicit version depending on the banners that are provided, or the things like the CSV or the CSS files that are linked in the HTTP bodies. We're able to detect the version based off of that and see who's doing on-prem.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of laid the foundation for what kind of data you're gathering, some of the basic things that you can do with it, maybe let's jump into, kind of what kind of changes have you seen with what's available on the public internet today? What are some of the trends that you've seen with this data over time? I know certainly, in the last I'd say 10 or 15 years, that there was like one of the big pivotal moments was from 80 to 443, right? Was the push to get everything, especially when Google started downranking anybody that wasn't using encryption. I think that was the big final push, and all of a sudden, we saw telecoms complaining that they couldn't add value-add services because they couldn't read the actual data being sent across the internet because everything was encrypted now. Have you seen any other interesting trends as you work with this data?
Yeah, certainly. A couple come to mind. First off is TLS. cipher selection. It's a very interesting process, but nowadays there's only about 2 or 3, maybe 4 if you're really looking at it, of shared ciphers that are across multiple platforms, multiple servers. But we're actually able to see which ciphers are being used and which is the default cipher for all of the IPv4 addresses that have 443 or any TLS enabled for any of the services. So we've been seeing movement there. We've also been seeing movement, at least in the threat hunting community, of them trying to hide their C2s a little bit better. Definitely, before everyone would just broadcast like, I'm such and such C2 server, like in the server header, which was a little ridiculous, but they've been moving away from it, from that side of things. But we've also been seeing some new services kind of emerge. Recently started introducing IPP scanning, so quite literally printer scanning. So we've seen more of those come online in the recent years. Other things that have kind of stand out to me, we've had all sorts of really interesting services that we started to scan. We scan SIP, stuff like that, and it just boggles my mind what people leave on the internet. It's like the Shodan Safari or whatever it is. It's constantly changing and constantly quite interesting. But in terms of other trends, nothing really comes to mind out of the ordinary, outside of just how long it takes people to kind of react after some of these 0 days or CVEs come out. We're actually able to monitor like that, the rollout of patches. The other thing I've kind of noticed is after a CVE comes out, people actually spin up more of that vulnerable service, whether it's a honeypot or if they're trying to replicate it themselves. It propagates more. Yeah.
That makes sense, right? People want to capture a copy of the exploit, see what the attack looks like, maybe gather the, make a list of the IP addresses. But yeah, that's happened in the past. Like people would report on, there's this many vulnerable versions out there, and I'd always ask, yeah, but how many of those are just security companies with honeypots or security programs, luring people in versus actual vulnerable instances?
Certainly. And in some cases, we're able to tell. We've been kind of tracking this recent wave of honeypots that have been spun up on seemingly Amazon ASNs, but we've been calling them kind of tar pits. And they're made for internet scanners. So it's based on like software identification and server headers, and it tries to get internet scanners to identify as many possible different versions to attract specific hackers to specific pieces of it. So it's been interesting to see it, but yeah, we're definitely working on the honeypot identification side of things, and it's immensely fascinating to see what people try to attract specifically. Also from the other side of it, like Gray Noise has been, tracking the receiving side or the exploiting side of it, and it's quite fascinating.
Right, because I mean, it's such a the whole security scorecard space, a bunch of insurance companies now, like there's so many parties scanning the whole internet now that you kind of do need, the Gray Noise makes sense. You need somebody in that position to say, yeah, you don't have to worry about this. Maybe you should worry about this, kind of to the name of it, separate the noise from the signal there. What's benign, I think in their terminology versus not benign.
Absolutely. It also has a pretty interesting couple of fields that we use from Censys's perspective. Obviously, Gray Noise identifies Censys quite frequently, but we can also identify people trying to spoof Censys or spoof other scanners. Many people will pretend to be Shodan or Censys when doing mass exploitation. Yeah. There's a spoofable field in Gray Noise that is always piques my interest.
Yeah, I mean, you can set the user agent to whatever you want, right? You can you can pretend to be the Google scanning bot, right?
Absolutely, yeah. But you'll know pretty quickly, depending when it starts hitting random paths and it's trying to guess random environmental paths and other stuff. It's like I don't think Google is trying to brute force my admin panel.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Behavior, in other words.
Certainly.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's Well, so that brings up an interesting question talking about gray noise. One of the things I noticed scanning the whole internet is that a lot of people don't like to be scanned, and you'll get abuse notices. And so I had to build out my exclusion list from that. So I wonder, like, do you have a sense for how large a chunk of the internet you're generally not allowed to scan? And how big of an issue is that? Like, if I'm the bad guys and I have a set of IPs, can I just request everybody not scan me? Or are they just mostly using, throwaway, VPSs and IP addresses from Amazon, Alibaba Cloud, whatever?
Yeah, often we do see it from the VPS providers, DigitalOcean and such. That's what I've been tracking most of our C2s recently. But when it comes to exclusion lists, at Censys, we actually do respect and follow those. But in terms of the greater percentage of the internet that we do not scan, it's close to like 0.03%. So it's a really small subset. Most of it's universities and such like that just don't want us touching their stuff. But most people, our scans are non-intrusive and we don't do any path traversal or anything like that. So it's a pretty low effort in that front. But people do definitely have some strong opinions when it comes to that.
Yeah. So we mentioned. Oh, go ahead, Katie.
Oh no, you go ahead. I'll follow up.
Well, I was about. You might as well. I was about to switch gears anyway.
Okay. I was going to, go back a little bit to, talking about honeypots and, how this intersects, people not wanting you to scan their assets in the external attack surface. How are companies dealing with the plethora of information they get? Because, you said it at the beginning of this interview, the amount of data that they can get is so overwhelming. And there has to be a way for them to manage it, to triage it, to understand not just where their vulnerabilities are, but where their downstream vulnerabilities are, what the so-called blast radius is. So how's the average company dealing with it? Because right now, so much data, probably not enough people in the majority of security programs.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that comes to mind there is, from Censys perspective, we have the attack surface management product, which helps us prioritize those risks for the users. We flag different common things that we see. We flag different CVEs as they come out. We have a wonderful rapid response team that's able to crank out some pretty interesting fingerprints as these vulnerabilities or 0 days are released. But for the sheer quantity of information, there's definitely a sense of alert fatigue. That is definitely not going to go away anytime soon, especially with some of the recent 0 days we've been seeing. But it really comes down to prioritizing that blast radius exactly. So trying to figure out what assets are most publicly exposed or have the most vulnerable applications and kind of focusing there, working with their different teams to prioritize that. But it's definitely a struggle we see for our customers and companies as a whole.
So in following on that, in terms of prioritization, you said that the tool can help prioritize, and obviously that's really important as well. But what about customization per company? Because it's one thing for you to be able to recommend something, and another thing for an organization to prioritize their own risk. So how much flexibility or customization can a customer get?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. So for our ASM product, you can actually customize the severity of any risk in our platform. So the one that we see a lot is FTP. So for certain banks and certain other financial institutions, they have to use FTP actually to submit payroll requests. So FTP is an accepted risk they have, and there's a certain set of standards that they have for securing them. But in our platform, we do label having an FTP service exposed as a medium risk, which for the average company is in fact a medium risk, but it is an accepted risk that they can set to low or ignore within our platform.
How about exploitability? Because vulnerability is one thing, exploitability is a whole other game.
Certainly. So For the exploitability, we don't attempt any exploits. Being from the third party perspective, it's really important to us that we don't try to execute any of these. So in some cases, we're able to have the exploitability based on software versions or things like that, but we don't truly have a exploitability field or a way to do it. Oftentimes, we can suggest remediation or ways to check if it is exploitable for the company itself, but we don't attempt to do that from our side.
And when you're talking about honeypots and, setting up those capabilities and looking for those, I know you can't reveal a lot, but what are some of the more interesting attempts that you've seen in the last year, especially as we've come into sort of this newer world of this hybrid work from anywhere? I have my printer over here connected to my computer, which is connected to my corporate network. You have all of this stuff connected, but it's not, it moves all the time. Everything is ephemeral, because I could be working from here today, and then tomorrow I could be working from a completely different location, a coffee shop, a different state, whatever it may be. And so that makes exposure really hard. So, what are some best practices? What kinds of things have you seen that are cropping up as trends in terms of findings?
Yeah, certainly. So a couple things come to mind, at least in the home network side of things. We do have a version of our product we call Henry, HNRI, home network resource information, or I'm forgetting the acronym off the top of my head here. But it does allow companies to add their employees' IPs to make sure that they don't have any ports or anything forwarded on their home network. As just a general tip, don't open ports on your network, or specifically your router, unless you know exactly what you're doing and are able to ensure that it is secure. Oftentimes we'll see printers pop up. Every once in a while we'll see some kid spinning up a Minecraft server on their parents' network, and it's like, no, please don't open that to the network. Things like that are definitely opening yourself up to further attacks. But in terms of findings and honeypots, I've seen a couple interesting things. I'll link the article to the tar pits, but there's also some interesting stuff going around with, they call it gas pot. There's a protocol called ATG, Automatic Tank Gauge, and it's really fascinating. People have spun up honeypots for the automated tank gauge protocol. So they're able to see who's trying to exploit gas stations specifically. That's been pretty interesting. There's also things like MadPot that I would definitely check out. But the ephemerality of assets is something that we are continuously trying to address, especially when it comes to cloud, and, spinning up EC2s and having those be ephemeral. It's a really difficult problem to try to address.
So gas station exploitability, that is definitely a first for me. Are you talking about how attackers are potentially trying to attack the point of sale systems?
So it's not necessarily point of sale systems. It actually is the tanks themselves. There's an emergency shutoff feature on it, and it's most certainly should be protected by a password. But most of the time, it is just set up by some random company and then put on the internet to be monitored from afar. But it has the ability to check the levels of the tanks, turn off the tanks, it set the prices, all that type of stuff is done through this.
And that's
software.
Regulated. They're required to run that, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Yeah, in certain states they are. So it's pretty interesting to see. But yeah, I linked the honeypot down below here. But it's surprising how many you can find that are legitimate and that are these honeypots.
That's by Stephen Hilt. He's down in Chattanooga. He's part of our local East Tennessee InfoSec community.
Small world.
Small world. Sorry, Katie.
No, go ahead. I'm just. You sent me a screenshot, and I'm looking at it, going, I would be a terrible attacker, because it would never occur to me to want to look for something like that. It just wouldn't.
Yeah, funnily enough, it's a telnet interface. It's a plain telnet interface, and just with some special characters that are publicly accessible. There's the commands are highly documented. You can do some real strange things with it, let alone people connecting other devices that are probably risky, especially from the enterprise perspective. People putting up unexposed or unprotected cameras, things like that. We try to be very sensitive about how we, approach these type of fields. But it is immensely interesting what you find on those similar networks.
Yeah, it was always. I used to follow some folks, back when Twitter was more active with InfoSec, who would just do this, who would just get bored and search the internet for weird stuff. Like they, write a script that would just screenshot VNC, right? And you get stuff like this. You'd get water treatment plants. You get breweries. These different like boiler control systems and things like that. Look like they're running on Windows 95. Yeah, it's amazing. I used to be a PCI QSA, and one of my clients once was a very large gas station travel center company, and yeah, they did have the network segmented where like the stuff that the government needed to be able to connect to check how much fuel they had on hand, that kind of stuff was completely segmented on their local networks. But yeah, it wasn't really part of the audit because there's no payment data there. But I always wondered, like, are they, connecting via VPN access these? Or are they just on the public internet? Like, how are they getting into this stuff? And it was just a lot of weird specialized stuff. And I'm sure it's not just the oil and gas industry. I'm sure other industries have weird telnet protocol legacy stuff like this.
Quite certainly, yeah. And speaking of the water and gas industry, one that comes to mind is obviously the Colonial Pipeline hack from a couple of years ago, and that was exclusively done via a VPN client or a VPN server that they had on one of their networks that they were able to pivot through. We see things like that a lot, or people spinning up things like AnyConnect or RDP on things that are obviously not meant to be exposed. Like, for example, once I found an X-ray machine that had an RDP server on it, and it was like, why is this happening?
Probably for support.
There has to be HIPAA coming in there.
Yeah, so I imagine it's support, right? Like the whole Okta thing with the HAR files. Like there's a certain level of access you have to have and convenience that has to be there to be able to troubleshoot people's issues, right? And so, that whole Okta thing happened just because people weren't scrubbing creds out of their HAR files that they were uploading to the support site. So I imagine that's where a lot of this remote access stuff comes from, is either, the people supporting it are like a third party, like it's a managed service, or it's the vendor themselves. Part of the contract is probably they require access into those systems. Back in the day, it used to be dial-up modems. I imagine there's still probably some dial-up modems out there, but that eventually turned into VNC and RDP and stuff like that. I imagine.
Yeah, no, and funnily enough, we still do see some things like, for example, ham radio controllers. We still see a couple Windows 5 devices that are running ham controllers, things like that. It's all sorts of these legacy protocols. We see things like, if you've seen FlightAware, there's some of these open source Wi-Fi or like radio antennas that monitor airplanes that are just littered across the internet because the people just set up little Raspberry Pis, hook them up to 5G hotspots, and then open all the ports and don't even think about it. And it's really scary. These are open source pieces of software that if you have the ability to, you can look into it and make sure they're doing a couple things right. But there's no way you can prevent everything and anything exploitable. So it's really just trying to limit what is connected to the internet and what it has access to on your internal network as well.
Yeah, I imagine you can find airplanes, boats, satellites on Censys.
Certainly. I've definitely found a couple submarine controllers, which are pretty interesting. They were for subnautical research. So you could monitor the different little drones and things like that. And mind you, no default password, no nothing, just like the index page directly. Didn't even have to look for any paths or anything. All sorts of stuff's out there, and it's really fascinating and a little terrifying. It makes me want to kind of check myself frequently. If anyone's listening and wants to give a check of their own thing, we do have this little tool. It's called me.censys.io. It automatically pulls up your current IP and checks it against Censys just to see if we see anything for it. So there's a couple interesting tools like that out there. But it's pretty shocking what people decide to connect to the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a little device called a Fingbox that I put on my network, and that's one of the many things it does. Is it notifies me if I suddenly open any ports to the public internet.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I used to use a Ping, and the pie holes are pretty good, especially if you're routing your DHCP and everything through there. You can block any outgoing or ingoing traffic. Regardless of working for an internet scanning company, the first thing I do anytime I set up a network is I block all the scanners as soon as I possibly am able, because while it's a good thing to have it scanned, I still, I can run the scans myself and not worry about external, malicious actors attempting to compromise my internal network.
Yeah, so you mentioned, or I mentioned in the intro, Censys GPT. So what's the idea behind that? I imagine it's still leveraging the same data that you've got, just like you're experimenting with the front end, right? Like different ways of finding what you're looking for.
Yeah, so it doesn't actually use any of our data directly. We at Censys, we have a DSL, a domain-specific language that we use for searching all of our fields. We have about, I think it's over 1,000 fields at the moment, and I can't remember exactly, the name of every field every time I want it. So it's just a really quick way of being able to type in English and get out a DSL query to help you find exactly what you're finding. So you can type something in like, show me all Russian hosts that are running RDP or FTP, and then it will spit out the DSL equivalent and open it in search for you to help you.
I understand. So this would be super useful with, like I imagine security teams, like you're using Velociraptor, you're using, Elastic, you're using all these different tools, and each of them have their own schemas. OS query, they have their own query language. And it's, I imagine people in SOCs and IR folks must have just like dozens of cheat sheets just hanging up all around them, or somewhere where they can easily access them. So this you just say in plain index, here's what I want to do, and it spits out the specific language.
Exactly. Yeah. So it also takes things in like Shodan queries or Zumai queries. We know that there's a lot of different syntaxes out there, and it can be a headache to learn all of them. It's taken me a couple of years to get just my head around a couple of them. So I tried to kind of embed that into a model that would then be able to translate the content. So, you type something in like http.html, like the Shodan version, and it translates it to services.http.response.body for the more specific DSL that we have. So it allows you to request things that are more specific, but it also is a little bit more verbose. So definitely more towards the research crowd there.
Yeah, very cool. I can see how that would save a ton of time. So, talking more about some of the community stuff you're doing, I imagine Censys is still supporting ZMAP and still uses it.
So part of it. So our founder Zakir, which is aptly named for ZMAP, Z, and he and the team do maintain the open source ZMAP project, but we do use modified versions of it on our side. In terms of other community work, we've recently been doing a whole push for open source technologies and different prototypes. We launched something called the Censys Workshop, which is just a series of open source GitHub projects that we are trying to push and trying to move forward different ways to access our data. But for the community portion, it's also really important for me personally to engage with different researchers. I personally really enjoy speaking with the threat hunting crowd. So tracking these new bots that come out, new C2s. Like recently, I've been looking at PikaBot, stuff like that. It's and also Darkgate is the other one that comes to mind. So as those come out, we try to integrate it into our scanners so we can mass identify them to report them to entities like ThreatFox or VirusTotal, or if they are running on Cloudflare, we try to report it through that way. But it's trying to cut down on some of this propagation of malware.
So just kind of personally curious, like how much of your time do you spend working on actual product features and things like that versus community research and stuff like that? Like, how is your role split up?
Certainly. So my role specifically, I'm a software engineer. So I'm going to be working on our new search product here shortly. But most of it is related to, I'd say about 3/4 of my time is product features or upgrades and bug fixes, that variety. And then the other quarter of my time I spend doing, researching or fingerprinting C2s, or recently I've been taking a look at different malware samples to see if I can track the connections that are outgoing from it. We've also been looking at things like DNS-CAT and other kind of versions of exfil data. But it's been pretty interesting. That's generally how I split my time, depending on, if something comes out like a new Peekabot or new Darkgate, like I might spend a little bit more time trying to get that fingerprinted so we have the scanning infrastructure sets up, because it does take a day or so to propagate and scan the full internet. So we want to make sure we jump on those, but most of my time is in the product engineering side of things.
Gotcha. Anything else interesting you want to share? That you're working on, writing about, events or anything like that coming up that you want to share before we wrap up here?
Certainly, I can share a couple things. I'll link it down in the Discord here. We recently created a map of the entire IPv4 space using a Hilbert curve, which I mentioned before, but it's a single image which represents the entire IPv4 space. So that's pretty interesting. You can zoom in on that. And then next week, we also have a threat hunting workshop that we're running in DC. And that's going to be kind of tracking down some of these C2s and kind of learning how to fingerprint them and how to kind of formulate and report these. But definitely want to make sure we're promoting that. And but yeah, I think other than that, there's just continually interesting things coming out as these 0 days kind of get published, and we figure out how to fingerprint them and how to track them down and how to identify our customers, but also identify the greater internet. Honestly, most people won't even know that they're hacked until after the fact. Like we've been following the sysaid stuff pretty closely. People are spinning up all sorts of things that are kind of questionable. So it's definitely always interesting. There's never a slow day.
I don't know if you guys have a merch store, but a poster of this would be pretty cool.
Yeah, right. I would love that, honestly. And also, I don't know if you noticed at the top, there's a high resolution version, which will take a moment, but it certainly looks quite cool. It's about a 50 megabyte image back there. So it takes a second, but I definitely think it's worth it.
Oh, yeah. No, I missed the link to that somewhere here. All right. Well, excellent stuff. Thank you so much for joining us today, Aidan. This was really great.
This was wonderful. Much appreciated.
All right. And don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're going to talk chaos and industry alignment with Kelly Shortridge, the author of the book Security Chaos Engineering.